The backstage hallway of the theater buzzed with nervous energy. Contestants paced in circles, whispered vocal warm-ups, stretched their hands, or stared silently at the floor as if preparing for battle. Stage crew members rushed by with headsets and clipboards while the muffled sound of a cheering audience echoed through the concrete walls. Michael sat alone on a folding chair near the far corner of the hallway, elbows resting on his knees, fingers intertwined tightly. The bright contestant number pinned to his dark jacket seemed almost too large against his thin frame. His breathing was calm, but his eyes carried years of exhaustion. A production assistant approached him carefully. "Michael, you're on in 5 minutes." He nodded politely. "Thank you." As she walked away, he glanced down at the worn photograph in his hands. The corners were bent and faded from being carried everywhere. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside his mother outside a tiny house with peeling paint and rusted windows. She was smiling proudly while he held a cheap microphone connected to an old karaoke machine. "You have a gift," she used to tell him. He could still hear her voice. But gifts did not always change lives. Sometimes they stayed hidden. Sometimes they died quietly. The booming voice of the announcer echoed through the hallway. "Please welcome Michael." The crowd erupted with applause. Michael slowly stood up. For one brief second, fear tightened around his chest. He had spent years singing in places where nobody listened. Small restaurants, empty bars, wedding receptions where guests talked louder than the music. He had performed while waiters dropped plates, while drunk customers shouted requests, while people scrolled through their phones without ever looking up. And now he was about to stand on the biggest stage in the world. The stage manager gave him a reassuring nod. "You got this." Michael stepped forward. The lights hit him instantly. The massive theater opened before his eyes like another universe. Thousands of people filled the audience seats. The judges sat behind the glowing desk, their faces curious but unreadable. The applause faded as Michael walked to the center of the stage. For a moment, the silence felt terrifying. Then one of the judges smiled. "Hello." "Hello," Michael answered softly. "What's your name?" "My name is Michael." "And where are you from?" "I'm from a small town in the Philippines." The audience cheered warmly. Another judge leaned forward. "So tell us, Michael. Why America's Got Talent? Why now?" Michael swallowed carefully. He glanced toward the audience before speaking. "My mother always believed I would stand on a stage like this one day." The room became quieter. "She passed away 3 years ago. Before she died, she told me something I never forgot. She said, even if the world ignores your voice today, keep singing until someone finally listens." A few audience members visibly softened. Michael continued, "I promised her I would try. So, I'm here." The judges exchanged glances. One of them smiled gently. "Well, this is your moment. Good luck." Michael nodded. The music began. At first, it was only a soft piano. Michael lowered his eyes. The audience settled into polite silence, expecting another decent audition. Then he sang the first line. Everything changed. The sound that came out of him did not feel human. It was raw and aching yet unbelievably controlled, filled with emotion so deep it felt like years of pain had suddenly exploded into music. His voice moved through the theater with impossible clarity, reaching every corner of the room. Conversations stopped instantly. Audience members who had been shifting in their seats froze. One judge's eyes widened. Another slowly removed her glasses. Michael continued singing. Every lyric sounded personal. Every note carried something broken. The audience wasn't just hearing music anymore. They were hearing grief, hope, loneliness, love. It felt as though Michael had opened his chest and allowed thousands of strangers to look directly into his soul. Halfway through the verse, the camera captured a woman in the audience covering her mouth with both hands. Another man shook his head in disbelief. A teenage girl near the front row began crying silently. Michael closed his eyes. For years he had imagined this moment while riding crowded buses home after failed gigs. He remembered carrying speakers through heavy rain because he could not afford transportation. He remembered singing 6-hour sets for almost no money. He remembered sleeping in tiny rented rooms where cockroaches crawled across the walls while he quietly practiced harmonies into a pillow so he would not disturb neighbors. He remembered every rejection, every time someone told him he was too emotional, too old, too ordinary, not marketable enough, not handsome enough. Not special enough. But standing under those lights, none of it mattered anymore. Because now they were listening. As the chorus approached, the music swelled. Michael lifted his head. Then he delivered a note so powerful that the entire theater exploded with shock. The audience gasped loudly. One judge slapped the table. Another whispered, "Oh my God." The note soared higher and higher without losing strength. It was flawless, pure, heartbreaking. By the time he reached the final word of the chorus, many people in the audience were already standing. Michael opened his eyes. He saw tears. Actual tears. People were crying because of his voice. For a split second, emotion nearly overwhelmed him. But the song wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the microphone and entered the second verse even softer than before. Now the theater leaned toward him. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. It felt like time itself had stopped. Backstage, crew members stared at the monitor screens in silence. One producer quietly muttered, "This is unreal." The judges looked stunned. They had seen thousands of auditions over the years. Great singers, terrible singers, performers desperate for fame, performers chasing second chances. But something about Michael felt different. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't performing tricks or chasing applause. He was simply telling the truth through music. And somehow that truth was shaking the entire room. As the song built toward its climax, the orchestra grew larger behind him. Michael gripped the microphone tighter. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from emotion. He thought about his mother watching old talent shows beside him on their tiny television. She used to laugh whenever he copied famous singers. "You'll be there someday," she always said. He never believed her. Not completely. Dreams like this were for other people. People with connections. People with money. People born lucky. Not someone like him. Yet somehow he had made it here. And now the entire world seemed to be holding its breath. Michael inhaled deeply. Then came the final chorus. The first note hit like lightning. The audience erupted before he even reached the second line. People stood from their seats one after another until almost the entire theater was on its feet. Some screamed. Others cried openly. One judge pressed both hands against her heart. Another simply stared at Michael with tears in his eyes. But Michael kept singing. The emotion pouring from him became even stronger. His voice cracked slightly on one lyric. Not from weakness, but from feeling, and somehow it made the performance even more powerful. Because it was real, painfully real. The giant screens above the stage showed close-ups of audience members wiping tears from their cheeks. A father held his young daughter tightly. Two strangers embraced. An elderly woman whispered something while crying softly. The entire theater had become emotional together. Michael reached the final sustained note. It rose higher, and impossibly higher. The band pulled back, leaving only his voice filling the theater. For several breathtaking seconds, nobody seemed to breathe. Then the note ended. Silence. One heartbeat. Two. And suddenly the theater exploded. The crowd roared louder than thunder. People jumped to their feet screaming. The judges stood immediately. One of them slammed the golden buzzer without hesitation. Gold confetti erupted from the ceiling. The audience completely lost control. Michael froze. He stared upward as golden paper rained around him. The noise became deafening. The crowd chanted his name. Michael, Michael, Michael. He covered his mouth in shock. Tears instantly filled his eyes. For years he had dreamed about surviving. He never imagined this. The judge who pressed the buzzer walked onto the stage. "You have no idea what you just did," she said emotionally. Michael tried to speak, but no words came out. The judge continued, "In all my years sitting at this table, I rarely see moments that feel truly unforgettable. But tonight, the second you started singing, everything changed." The audience cheered again. "You didn't just perform a song," she said. "You made every person in this theater feel something real." Michael finally wiped tears from his face. "Thank you," he whispered. Another judge approached him. "Where has this voice been hiding?" Michael laughed through tears. "Small restaurants," he answered honestly. The crowd reacted with disbelief. "No more restaurants," the judge replied immediately. The theater erupted again. Backstage, contestants watched the monitors in stunned silence. Some applauded. Others shook their heads in disbelief. One young singer whispered quietly, "How do you even follow that?" Meanwhile, Michael stood in the center of the stage surrounded by falling gold confetti. He looked upward again. For a brief moment, he imagined his mother watching. And suddenly the years of struggle no longer felt meaningless. The host joined him on stage. "How are you feeling right now?" Michael laughed nervously. "I think I'm dreaming." "Well, if this is a dream," the host said, "millions of people are about to dream with you." The audience roared again. Michael looked out at the sea of faces. A few minutes earlier, none of these people knew his name. Now they were chanting it. The realization hit him hard. His knees nearly gave out. The host held his shoulder supportively. "You deserve this." Michael closed his eyes briefly. For years he had questioned whether continuing music made sense. Friends had moved on. Some started businesses. Some built families. Others found stable careers. Meanwhile he kept chasing uncertain gigs and impossible dreams. There were nights he nearly quit completely. Nights he stared at his reflection and wondered whether talent alone could ever overcome reality. But something inside him always refused to stop. Maybe because of his mother. Maybe because singing was the only place where he truly felt alive. Or maybe because deep down he believed that somewhere, somehow, someone would eventually listen. Tonight they finally had. As the judges returned to their seats, the crowd still refused to sit down. The standing ovation continued longer than anyone expected. Michael stood there speechless. One judge leaned into the microphone. "You know what amazes me most?" Michael looked toward him. "You never once sounded like you were trying to impress us. You were simply sharing your heart. That's why this became magical." The audience applauded loudly. Another judge nodded. That performance reminded people why music matters in the first place. Michael lowered his head emotionally. "Thank you so much," he said again. The host smiled. "You're going straight to the live shows." The crowd exploded yet again. Michael covered his face. He could barely process what was happening. As he walked off stage, audience members reached toward him from the front rows. Some cried while clapping. Others shouted encouragement. "You deserve this. You're incredible. Never stop singing." Michael thanked them repeatedly. The moment he stepped backstage, crew members surrounded him with applause. One camera operator wiped tears from his eyes. "I've worked here 8 seasons, he said. "That might be the best audition I've ever seen." Michael stood frozen. He still felt like the same struggling singer from hours earlier. Yet the world around him had suddenly transformed. A producer approached holding a phone. "Michael," she said breathlessly, "your audition is already exploding online." He blinked. "What?" She turned the screen toward him. Millions of views were climbing rapidly across social media. Comments flooded endlessly. "Who is this guy? I've never cried from an audition before. This voice healed something in me. I got chills the second he started singing." Michael stared at the screen in disbelief. Hours earlier he had worried whether anyone would remember his performance. Now people around the world were sharing it. The producer smiled. "You just changed your life." But Michael barely heard her. His thoughts drifted back years earlier to a tiny room during one of the hardest periods of his life. He remembered sitting alone after another failed audition. The rejection had been brutal. The producer barely looked at him before saying, "You're good, but not unforgettable." Michael had walked home through heavy rain that night feeling completely defeated. When he entered the house, his mother immediately knew something was wrong. "They rejected me again," he had told her. She listened quietly. Then she handed him a towel and smiled. "Maybe they simply haven't heard you at the right moment yet." Back then her words sounded comforting but unrealistic. Tonight, standing backstage after bringing an entire theater to tears, he finally understood what she meant. Sometimes timing changes everything. The host suddenly appeared backstage holding a microphone. "Michael, social media is going insane right now. People are calling this one of the greatest AGT auditions ever." Michael laughed nervously. "That sounds impossible." "It's happening." The host pointed toward another monitor showing clips of audience reactions during the performance. People crying. Judges standing. The golden buzzer exploding. Michael watched silently. It almost felt like he was looking at someone else. Then the host asked softly, "What would your mother say if she could see this moment?" Michael's eyes immediately filled again. He looked downward. After several seconds, he finally answered. "She'd probably say, 'See, I told you not to stop singing.'" The host smiled emotionally. "That's beautiful. Michael inhaled shakily. For the first time in years, the heavy weight he carried inside felt lighter. Not gone completely, but lighter, because the dream that once seemed impossible had suddenly become real. As the night continued, audience members leaving the theater still talked about him. People replayed clips on their phones in parking lots. Videos spread across social media faster every minute. Reaction channels uploaded emotional responses. Fans began calling his performance legendary. By midnight, major entertainment pages were already posting headlines. The unknown singer who left AGT speechless. The voice nobody saw coming. The moment Michael changed everything. But far away from the cameras and headlines, Michael eventually found himself alone in a quiet dressing room. The noise from the theater had faded. The confetti was gone. The screaming crowds were distant memories. Only silence remained. He sat slowly in front of the mirror. For several moments he simply stared at his reflection. He looked exhausted, overwhelmed, but also different somehow, like someone who had finally stepped into the life they were always meant to live. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages flooded non-stop. Old classmates, former coworkers, musicians he once performed beside. Even people who had ignored him for years suddenly reached out. But one message captured his attention more than all the others. It came from his younger sister. "Mom would be so proud of you." Michael stared at the words. Then he finally broke down completely. Not the quiet tears he held back on stage. Real tears. Years of pressure, disappointment, grief, sacrifice, and hope poured out all at once. He buried his face in his hands while sobs shook his shoulders. Because after all the struggles, after all the failures, after all the moments he nearly gave up, something extraordinary had finally happened. The world listened, and for the first time in a very long time, Michael truly believed his future might be bigger than his past. Outside the dressing room, producers continued discussing his performance excitedly. "This is the kind of moment people remember forever," one said. He connected with everyone. No gimmicks, just pure emotion. Meanwhile, Michael slowly wiped his eyes. He looked once more at the old photograph of his mother. Then he smiled. Not the nervous smile from earlier. Not the uncertain smile of someone hoping to survive. A real smile. The smile of someone who finally understood that every painful step of the journey had led here. Back to this moment. Back to this stage. Back to the instant when one song changed everything. Weeks later, millions of people would still replay the audition online. Fans would analyze every note. Reaction videos would gather enormous views. Music producers would contact him. Interview requests would flood in. But none of those things would ever matter as much as the moment itself. The moment the theater went silent. The moment strangers began crying. The moment an unknown singer opened his mouth and reminded people what genuine emotion sounds like. And perhaps most importantly, the moment Michael finally realized that his mother had been right all along. Even when the world ignores your voice, you keep singing. Because someday, somewhere, someone will finally listen. And when they do, everything changes.